Well, our formal garden is another one of our very popular components of our studio gardens with the various herbs and various ornamentals. And as a matter of fact, this year we had our first request for a wedding to be held here at our studio gardens, of which the reception was held right here in our formal gardens, and that's really a very nice compliment. But to tell you the truth, the formal garden has been quite a learning experience for us here, because initially what we did with our InstaWalk pavers, we dug the ground out and set the pavers down in there, and basically we just formulated a clay concrete pond in a way. Water stands in it, and you can see that just about the only thing that likes it is some of the dandelions that are taking over. Now, of course, they're a cool season annual crop that pops up this time of year, so they're real happy with the cool temperatures and the freeze, and they're getting very aggressive. And the way they're growing out between the cracks, it's going to be really hard to pull those out by hand, so we're probably going to have to use some Roundup or glyphosate to spot treat and kill those out. And we'll be able to get that in hand. Now, really what we should have done is raise the bed up a little bit and set the pavers on the ground so it would drain better, and that's a learning experience that we've had that we would do differently the second time around. Now, another concern was a walnut tree here behind me. We weren't quite sure if it would have an allelopathic reaction to any of the plants as far as being toxic and causing them not to grow. And really the only problem we've had so far is the aggressive growth of the walnut tree has kind of shaded out some of the plants on this east end, and so they're growing at an angle towards the sun, towards the west, and so the shading has been a little bit of a problem. Of course, now that the fall has come and our freeze, we have lots of walnuts that we can harvest that have fallen on the ground. So we'll probably do a little bit of selective tree pruning to get the shading part under control, but so far no chemical reactions, and we'll keep an eye on that. But of course there's a lot of positive things to the formal garden too, especially the geometric patterns that were designed in the formal garden with some of our horticulture students earlier this spring. Now, if you joined us back during that time, you'll remember that the students came in, designed the beds, and again they wanted kind of an herb knot garden, which is using various herbs that can be trimmed and shaped and hedged, forming geometric patterns. And sure enough, we've had a lot of growth during the summer, and you can see those shapes taking place, and it's really attractive, using gray Santolina, which is this one here, and green Santolina, and those are used as ornamental ground covers, but also various purposes for herbs. Now, in between the circles of the geometric patterns, we have some of our scented geraniums, which are not cold hardy, and that's pretty obvious, but prior to the freeze we came in and took cuttings so we can plant back in next year versus trying to overwinter such a huge plant. Now, one thing that we needed to keep up with was making sure that these geraniums in the center did not shade the geometric pattern with the Santolina, which it did. You can see those areas are shaded, and so they're a little bit more straggly. We needed to keep these pruned a little bit better too. Also, a very important point that I want to show to you, prior to this freeze over the Halloween weekend, we didn't really get a lot of moisture. And matter of fact, there had been about 3 or 4 weeks prior to that since we'd had any rain. So the soil temperatures were pretty warm, but there was a lack of moisture. And the areas that had a little bit more moisture, the plants came through the freeze a little bit better since they're perennial and they're more rigid, turgid, they're very sturdy. The areas that was dried out a little bit, you can see have wilted and really succumbed to the freeze more, plus the areas that were shaded out from the plant also had an impact. So that's why it's very important for you to remember, prior to a heavy or a hard freeze, if we're not getting any moisture, you need to go out and water the soil to make sure it's not soggy, but there's enough moisture that the plant can take it up in the plant, and actually it helps insulate it because it's not dehydrating, and it will come through the freeze a little bit better. So never forget to keep those water on during the winter months, especially during dry conditions, or you'll lose some more of your plants. Now, we've also used a Santolina on the outside borders of our L-shaped beds and just put it along the edge to trim it. Now, one thing when you're trimming, we really don't need to do much to it now because we want it to be insulated, and depending on how cold the winter gets, we may get some burning and it could die back a little bit, but it'll come back. But we use shears once it gets to a particular side, and we cut it at an angle like so, and then go across the top, and again at an angle. We never cut it straight across where it's straight up and down, The reason for that is you want a slope of an angle, because if you cut it straight up and down, you don't get as much sunlight to the bottom and it will shade it out. So anytime you're doing this on big hedges or small ones, always cut an angle where the base is lower to the bottom, where it will also get sunlight. So you're really not making a complete square, you're making more of an angle when you're hedging. Now some of our smaller things in the center, like English lavender and germander, which is a little bit darker green, glossy green, those are also perennials, maybe will die to the ground, but we're going to leave the foliage to help insulate. And now that they're getting established, we'll be able to use smaller hand shears to come in and trim those next year to form even smaller geometric patterns. But those particular plants were planted down the center, and we've just kind of let them grow aggressively to fill in and help shade out the weeds. But we can do a lot better job of trimming those next year. But right now we're just going to leave everything to help insulate for the winter. Now, of course, one of the most colorful things in the formal garden have been our tree roses. Now, if you're familiar with tree roses, some of them are budded at the ground layer. Some of them are used just a traditional rootstock and budded up here at the top, so you can have both or either or. They're a lot more susceptible to cold damage, which you could expect. Now, some people will dig the complete rose out where it's bare root and just throw it in the garage or something to make sure it doesn't freeze. Others will try to wrap the base like we do with some of our other budded ones. But really what you need to worry about is the top dying back, and so that's really hard to protect. I've seen individuals go to the trouble to trim this back real closely, pack it with compost or leaves, newspaper, various things, and cover it maybe with like burlap to help insulate this part that's budded right here. But that to me is a lot of trouble too. Now, you can also go to an added expense and use what is called an insulator blanket, and these are available mostly through mail order, where you can protect the whole plant. And it has Velcro that you can stick, strings to get it as tight as you can, and you can see there's a thickness and insulating foam in the center to actually protect it to some pretty cold temperatures, but they're very expensive, and trying to protect each of them would add up pretty quickly. So what we're going to do is we're just going to leave them here and just hope that we have a pretty decent winter, and then really try to just look at the damage next year after the winter, because we want them to be as hardy as they can and just try to get through on their own, with the thought in mind that we could lose some of them. Now, this year we've had several theme gardens on the show that the students helped out with, and they were very successful in a lot of interesting points. For example, I'm in the herb knot garden that I just talked to you about, and we had a brochure developed through the Oklahoma Botanical Garden and Arboretum that lists the plants that are growing in our herb garden. You'll see we talk about Santalina, some of the scented geraniums that we use, creeping thyme, etc. But if you would like one of the brochures on any of our theme gardens, which was the annual barn garden, the edible garden, everlasting, the vegetable, and the giant vegetable, there may have been cultivars that you have seen or various plants throughout the year that maybe you wanted to try in your particular garden, or you want to get more information. You can write to us and send a stamped self-addressed envelope to Oklahoma Gardening, 360 Ag Hall, and that's Stillwater, Oklahoma, 74078. And be sure and request which one of the brochures you would like, whether you want the, again, the herb knot garden annual, the edible, the everlasting, vegetable, or giant vegetable, and we'll be sure and send one of those to you and maybe give you some more ideas about some of the cultivars that we grew this year to help you out in your planning for next year's garden. But again, I think there's still a lot of things we need to keep in mind as far as maintenance and protection of the plants during the winter. And even though we've had our first freeze and it's kind of going downhill, some things will pull up, others will protect and insulate, but don't forget about watering. That's the most important thing, to make sure the plants make it through the harsh, cold winter.